A stone slab sits in a museum in Jerusalem. It's cracked, weathered, barely legible, but scratched into its surface is a name that changed everything: Pontius Pilate. The man who, according to 4 ancient accounts, washed his hands and sent a Jewish preacher to die on a Roman cross. For centuries, critics said Pilate was a literary invention. Then, in 1961, a team of Italian archaeologists dug up this stone from the ruins of a Roman theater in Caesarea. And suddenly, a character from a religious text was standing on solid ground. That stone opens a question most people think has already been answered, or they assume it can never be answered at all. Did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? Not as a divine figure, not as a theological concept, as a man, a flesh and blood person who walked through Galilee, gathered followers, and was executed by Rome. The answer doesn't come from faith. It comes from manuscripts, hostile witnesses, dirt, and bones. And the trail of evidence is far stronger than almost anyone realizes. But to understand why, we need to step back and look at the problem the way a historian would. Not with belief, not with suspicion, with patience. Because the real surprise isn't what the evidence says. It's how close that evidence sits to the events it describes. You're holding a fragment of paper. It's smaller than your palm, torn at the edges, covered in faded Greek letters. This scrap is called Papyrus 52, and it contains a few verses from the Gospel of John. It was written roughly 95 years after Jesus' death. That sounds like a long gap, and the common assumption is that a gap that wide makes any document unreliable. Stories drift, details change, memories fail. But here's where the assumption collapses. Take Herodotus, the man often called the father of history. His works survive in copies made more than 11 centuries after he wrote them. 11 centuries of silence between the original and the oldest surviving copy. Nobody questions whether Herodotus existed. Nobody throws out his accounts of the Persian Wars because the manuscript trail is long. Yet the New Testament sits on a foundation of copies that arrive far, far sooner. Paul's letters, the earliest Christian writings we have, were composed within 20 years of the crucifixion. That's not ancient legend drifting through centuries of retelling. That's a man writing letters to communities who could have corrected him if he'd gotten the basic facts wrong. And Paul didn't write in a vacuum. He quotes what historians recognize as short summary statements of belief that predate even his own letters. One of those summaries, found in his first letter to the Corinthians, traces back to within 5 years of Jesus' death. Close enough that eyewitnesses were still alive. Close enough that lies would have been contested. Now, the obvious pushback is this. These are Christian sources. Of course, Christians would preserve accounts of their founder. What about people who had no stake in the story? What about the outsiders, the indifferent bureaucrats, the hostile historians who had every reason to ignore or dismiss this movement? That's where things get interesting, because they didn't ignore it. A Jewish historian named Josephus, writing in Rome around 63 years after Jesus' death, mentions him in 2 separate passages. One of those passages has been debated for centuries. Medieval Christian scribes clearly added phrases to it, inserting language that no Jewish author would have written. But modern analysis has peeled back those later additions, isolating a core of roughly 17 words that fit Josephus' style and vocabulary. Those words describe a wise man named Jesus, who performed surprising deeds and was condemned to the cross by Pilate. Josephus had no reason to invent this. He was writing a history of the Jewish people for a Roman audience. Jesus was a footnote in a much larger story. But Josephus wasn't alone. Tacitus, one of Rome's most respected historians, wrote about the Great Fire of Rome in his Annals. He needed to explain who these Gautan Christians were that Emperor Nero had blamed for the fire. And his explanation is blunt. He says their name comes from Christus, who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Tacitus despised Christians. He called their movement a deadly superstition. He had zero motivation to confirm their claims, and yet he recorded the basic outline of the story. including the name, the execution method, and the Roman governor responsible. Then there's Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor writing to Emperor Trajan, describing early Christians who sang hymns to Christ as if to a god. And Suetonius, who notes disturbances among Jews in Rome under someone called Chrestus, barely 2 decades after the events. 4 independent non-Christian authors. 4 separate contexts, none of them friendly to the movement. All of them confirming that a figure called Christ or Christus was at the center of a real, disruptive, spreading community. But wait, you might be thinking, these writers are still decades removed from Jesus' life. They're reporting what they've heard. They could be repeating Christian claims without checking them. That's a fair point. And it's exactly why the physical evidence matters so much. Remember that stone from Caesarea. It didn't just confirm a name. It confirmed a title, a time period, and a location. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, governing exactly when and where the Gospels place him. That's not a lucky coincidence between a religious text and a rock. That's a point of contact between 2 completely independent sources of information. Then construction workers south of Jerusalem's Old City stumbled onto an ancient burial cave. Inside, they found an ornate bone box inscribed with Aramaic words. The inscription read, "Joseph, son of Caiaphas." Caiaphas, the high priest who, according to the Gospels, presided over Jesus' trial. His bones had been sitting in that cave for nearly 2,000 years, waiting. And in more recent years, archaeologists in Nazareth uncovered the foundation of a 1st-century house, with hearth charcoal that carbon dating placed squarely in the mid-1st century. This matters because some arguments against Jesus' existence have claimed Nazareth didn't even exist as a settlement during his lifetime. The dig proved otherwise. A small village, humble, with stone walls and cooking fires. Exactly the kind of place the Gospels describe. Stones and bones anchor names and places. But they can't tell us which stories about a person are true and which were added later. For that, historians use a different set of tools. And one of those tools is, honestly, a little strange. It's called the criterion of embarrassment. The idea is simple but powerful. If a community invents a story about its founder, that story will make the founder look good. It will serve the community's message. It will be convenient. So when you find a story in the tradition that's awkward, one that creates problems for the people telling it, you're probably looking at something real. Because why would they make it up? Take Jesus' baptism by John. This scene appears in multiple early sources, and it's deeply uncomfortable for early Christians. If Jesus was the sinless Son of God, why did he submit to a baptism of repentance? If Jesus was greater than John, why did he go to John to be cleansed? Early gospel writers clearly wrestle with this. Matthew adds a scene where John protests, saying he should be the one baptized by Jesus. Later gospels downplay or omit the moment entirely. The tradition is trying to smooth over something embarrassing, which means the underlying event almost certainly happened. No one invents a problem and then struggles to explain it away. Peter's denial of Jesus is another example. The man who became the leader of the early church, the rock on which the community was built, ran away and lied about knowing Jesus 3 times on the night of his arrest. That's not the kind of origin story a movement makes up for its chief spokesman. That detail survives because it happened, and it was too well known to erase. Scholars have identified at least 5 episodes like this, moments that work against the community's interests and therefore carry a strong mark of historical memory. Alongside this, historians look for events that appear independently in separate sources that didn't copy from each other. A large number of distinct episodes from Jesus' life show up in at least 2 independent traditions. The feeding of the multitude, the entry into Jerusalem, the Passion narrative. These aren't single threads. They're a web. Now, you might expect the scholarly world to be deeply divided on all of this. That's certainly the impression you'd get from certain corners of the internet, where confident voices argue that Jesus was nothing more than a recycled pagan myth. Osiris died and rose. Adonis died and rose. Mithras was born in a cave. The pattern is clear, they say. Jesus is just the Jewish version of a universal template. But here's where that argument breaks down. Scholars have tested it. They've taken the pagan figures most commonly cited as Jesus parallels and checked how many specific traits each one actually shares with the Jesus story. The result? Only a tiny handful share more than one generic feature with Jesus. And even those operate in cultural and religious settings completely unrelated to first-century Judaism. Osiris rules an Egyptian underworld. Adonis is a Greek vegetation spirit. Neither one has anything to do with Jewish ideas about a coming king, with a Jewish teacher executed by Rome, with a movement that exploded out of a specific community in a specific province at a specific moment in history. The surface similarities dissolve the moment you look closely. And the scholars themselves? Across major surveys spanning hundreds of researchers, more than 95% say Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person. This isn't a close call. This isn't a 50-50 debate with compelling arguments on both sides. The consensus is overwhelming, but here's a nuance that matters. Consensus doesn't mean certainty, and it definitely doesn't mean every detail in the Gospels is verified. Scholars fiercely debate the dating of specific manuscripts. They argue about whether certain passages in Josephus contain any genuine words at all, or were entirely inserted by Christian copyists. They disagree about the source document behind Matthew and Luke, whether it was a single text or multiple layers stitched together over time. The question of how literate ordinary people in rural Galilee actually were remains open, and the answer affects how we understand the shift from spoken memory to written text. In other words, the existence of Jesus is settled. The details of his life are where the real scholarly battles happen. And that distinction matters, because it means the conversation has moved far beyond did he exist and into ours what can we reliably know about him. That's a different question, a harder question, and a far more interesting one. Think about it this way. You're assembling a puzzle. No single piece shows you the whole picture. A papyrus fragment gives you the corner. A Roman historian's offhand remark gives you an edge piece. A bone box in a cave gives you part of the sky. A first-century house foundation gives you part of the ground. An embarrassing baptism story gives you a figure standing in a river, reluctant to be there. None of these pieces taken alone would be enough. But laid side by side, they start to form an outline. And that outline matches. The texts point to the same names the stones confirm. The hostile witnesses back up what the friendly sources claim. The finds from the ground anchor. The settings, the stories, describe. This is how history works. Not with courtroom proof, not with video footage, with convergence, with independent lines of evidence pointing in the same direction until the weight of them becomes difficult to dismiss. If this kind of evidence trail pulls you in, if you want to see how the same methods reveal other figures history almost forgot, the next story is already waiting for you. Subscribe so you don't miss it. That stone in Jerusalem is still cracked, still barely legible, but the name scratched into its surface held, and so did the man it pointed to.